Hi there, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another edition of Adam Interviews, where we are continuing to talk to people in our community doing things of note. And before we get to our guest today, I want to circle back to an interview I did about a month ago. You might remember you can actually still access it through the Rochester First app, but I interviewed my former professor at Syracuse University, Mirzad Baroujardi, who was a great influence in my life. And he talked about the war in Iran right as it was happening, and he has family in Tehran. His mom still lives there, and how there was a mix of emotions. His family had fought against the Shah back in the 70s, and he was no fan of the supreme leader, and yet he had concern for the people there and folks worldwide. So a lot of roller coaster of emotions. So when I called up this morning, Pouya Seifzadeh, you had used the exact same word. And first, I want to thank you for joining us. SUNY Geneseo professor, thank you so much for joining us, Pouya.
Thank you for having me.
So here we are. Before we talk about what happened last night and where we are today, what were you thinking leading up to that 8 p.m. deadline last night?
There were a lot of emotions, obviously. The rhetoric that was used in that threat that wasn't the truth was making me very uncomfortable. At the same time, I had some confidence that at some point it would not escalate to the level that was brought up in the rhetoric, based on the similar rhetoric that was used in the past. And then at some point, either there was an extension or a change in direction or even negotiations. I was very curious how things would move forward until 8 p.m. At around 7:30 p.m. when it was very apparent that on some informal channels that there was a possibility of a ceasefire. Then I was, and on American outlets, there was talk that President Trump is weighing the options. I was pretty confident that the ceasefire is going to take place.
So I should mention, I mean, I for some reason I thought it would be assumed, but that's silly on my part. Pouya is from Iran, moved to the U.S., and now lives and works in the Rochester area, and we're very happy to have him here, he and his wife. So what is it like you have family still in Iran? What is it like to live here and to really get the headlines and not be on the ground in Iran?
It is sometimes stressful, worrying for the people that are in Iran. At the same time, the ones at least that I am in contact with, they are more worried about what happens after the hostilities stop. So there is a genuine worry among the relatives that I have that I'm in contact with, that the regime would use this as an opportunity to further make things stricter on any opposition within the country. There is a genuine fear about whether this blackout of internet is going to persist, whether people that are in prison would be executed. So there are those worries. On the other hand, I have some friends that have younger kids. There is no way to really comfort them under these circumstances. All that we could tell them is to be safe. It's hard to really give people advice when you're sitting on this side of the fence, and a war is happening over there, and give them a promise that things are going to change for the better. But in a way, one of my friends told me that that's the way that he felt, that every bomb that explodes over there, we feel the effect here at home for every Iranian, and that is true. Whether we want this operation to lead to regime change, or if we're not really concerned with that, or we're just worried about our families, we do feel the impact here regardless.
Yeah, and look, I mean, the regime over there, a lot of people are living in the U.S. because they do not agree with what the regime stands for and does over there. So there must be quite a bit of conflict because you don't want to see the violence there, and many don't want to see the regime in place.
Yep, exactly. Uh, there is it's very difficult to really assess how many people or what portion of the population is against the regime. The closest that we have are the surveys that were administered by the Gammon Institute. They put the opposition to the regime at around 70%. It's it's may not be the most reliable method, but unfortunately, that is the only way those opinions can be collected in a most secure way. Among the Gen Z, the younger population that constitutes about like 30 million of the Iran's population, that opposition is even stronger. So for a lot of Iranians, they are walking a very thin line where they want to survive the war, they want to survive the regime, and they're hoping that now that they've gone through this ordeal, they at least there is going to be some positive outcome. Unfortunately, right now, everything is in a state of limbo. The worst possible outcome that they could consider is that a deal that would leave IRGC in control of all the affairs, and for them, for the Iranian civilians, not be able to exercise even the rights that they had prior to this conflict, and that started in February 28th.
Yeah, I think that you bring up, especially noting the potential huge amount of opposition that's in the country there, you bring up an important point here. There is a giant distinction between the regime and the people of Iran. Again, because of my mentor, I was able to at least get a more full perspective of the people of Iran, and it's a very rich culture. It goes back to the Persian Empire, and so obviously when we hear about destruction of a whole civilization, one has to hope that that means destruction of a regime, not the people. And I feared and continue to worry about the people there. If you want to talk about the kind of community that lies underneath the fist of the regime.
Yeah. Well, the Iranian population, it's it's a very modern society. It would be like 78% of Iranians live in urban areas. This is very different from most of the other Middle Eastern countries, North African countries. It's very urbanized, it's very well developed. Iran has a very widespread university system that started before the revolution. It grew tremendously after the revolution. It's not because the regime per se was really pushing for people to be highly educated. It was just one of the only ways in an economy that doesn't really provide a lot of pathways for entrepreneurs to grow. The only other way is for people to find their way through education. So that really gave way to all these universities, private universities, to grow. So a large number of Iranian population is educated. They have college degrees, and they want more. They want the same things that people have in Europe, the same things that people have in North America. They're very different from the Iranian regime that is trying to anchor them and send them back several decades. And the gap is widening. The things that the Iranian regime disagrees with, they don't really sit well with the Iranian society. And that is why there's a complete and total disconnect between the society and the regime. And we've seen now that the economic conditions in Iran have really failed, particularly in the past year. Then we saw that people take to the streets from whether with economic concerns, social concerns, political concerns, and demanding that they want to see some change. Well, the regime didn't really take that really well. They killed anywhere between 36,000 to 50,000 people in just 2 days. Horrifying pictures. And just to put that into perspective, the past 43 days, Iran has been bombarded more than any other country has ever been bombarded. The total number of casualties in Iran has been 1,255 civilians. 50,000 people died in 2 days on the streets of Iran, civilians. That's 40 times more than these 40 days. Uh, and that just tells us how brutal this regime is and what people were willing to do in order to see it gone.
Yeah, you see the butchery. I mean, do you look back? Do you wish that perhaps that there had been some type of intervention prior to the one we're seeing now, when people were on the streets?
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, we've seen um, Iranian people have tried many different paths to change their fate, and through democratic ways. The regime doesn't want to change. People tried, and they had in the late 80s, early 90s. We had these minor protests that took place in Mashhad, in the southern parts of Tehran. They met them with brutal violence. Then in the 1997, people decided that they're going to try another path. They will try to take over the parliament, try reforms. Look what happened to that. They tried at reforms for about a decade or more, but every time the regime restricted people's choices more and more. And the IRGC during these years grew from an organization, an entity that controlled only a fraction of Iranian economy to an organization that estimates put it at controlling anywhere between 35% to 50% of Iran's economy. You can't really import anything into Iran unless you import it through a private company that is somehow affiliated or owned by somebody that is connected through IRGC. You can't export oil unless it's done through intermediaries that are owned by companies that are owned by members or former members of IRGC. You can't get a license to manufacture anything in Iran unless you have some form of an affiliation with IRGC. They control all of the affairs. They have drained rivers, they have drained lakes, and that is where currently all of these missile cities exist. They've created a climate catastrophe in Iran, something that this country has been around for 7,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
What they've done to the country in the past 47 years, it's remarkable in a very horrific way. It's just something that can't really be imagined. It's so no, yeah, it's a very difficult situation.
Yeah, and it all started with betrayal. I think 78, 79, the intelligentsia had basically created a pact with the religious zealots to overthrow the Shah, and then the zealots, once that happened, turned and then went after their so-called partners.
Well, they had the guns, so they at the aftermath of the revolution, they were the ones with the guns, and they went after anybody that stood in their way. They got rid of the sort of all the nationalistic movements, the left leaning groups, any group that participated in the revolution, they ended up as in jails or executed. Tens of thousands of people were executed in jails during the first few years of Iran. Newspapers, when you read them, there are some archives that you can read. They're filled with pictures of people that were executed every single day. Yes, this is a regime that is built on violence, on execution of whoever was standing in their way, and they have built a reputation for that. And now, after 47 years, they're realizing that works, and they're using it once more.
When you hear the president of the U.S. say we're going to knock them back to the Stone Age, we're going to destroy a whole civilization, do you think that this is more rhetoric being used and directed to the regime, or is this something that you actually worry about?
I think it's more rhetoric. Just knowing, having been following President Trump, I think President Trump has this habit of throwing everything at the wall and see what sticks.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't really take the rhetoric that seriously very much. I usually look at the actions that he follows. Most of the actions seem to be more rational than the actual words. Yes, that rhetoric was totally unacceptable, threatening civilians, threatening civilian infrastructure. Even with, I hear some arguments on some outlets that, well, they're dual use, so they're legitimate targets. No, they're not. Any facility, any equipment that has a dual use, that does not make that a legitimate target. You can't really drain oxygen out of the room because military and civilians are both breathing that oxygen. So no, I don't take that rhetoric seriously. I think that was a little bit going too far. I know a lot of Iranians, they took that very personally. I think the regime really took advantage of that to galvanize some of its support. I don't think they were able to bring on a lot of people that were against regime to support the regime, but I think they were at least able to get some people that were actively seeking or supporting this military intervention to back down a little bit.
And so now I think there's a lot of confusion as to what negotiations are actually happening and what aren't, whether the Strait of Hormuz is opening or it's not. What are you gathering from, you are much more in tune to this than I, or I'm guessing many Americans. What are you gathering as the situation right now?
Right now, I think it's they're just trying to explore what happens next, because what ended up happening here is that the U.S. realized that the cost of opening the Strait of Hormuz will be too much. I don't think opening the Strait of Hormuz has a military solution. And now they're stepping back. They're going to reassess and see what is the other alternative. The problem is that in the midst of all of this, Iran has realized that they have a tool that they are willing to use going forward. So that's going to add to the cost of oil everywhere, shipping everywhere, and we're not going to go back to where we were prior to the February 28th. The only way that the Strait of Hormuz could be permanently opened would be if this regime that has its finger on the trigger is no longer there.
Right.
I think that they will soon realize, both the U.S. and Iran, that this negotiation is not going to yield the results that they expect. But at that point, they need to make a decision whether they're going to be happy with that or not. Iran will not surrender its missile program. There is absolutely no way they would do that. That is their only defense, and that would make them defenseless. At the same time, they're not going to let go of their control of the Strait of Hormuz, because now they know how they can control that, and there is no military in the world that can open it unless Iran is willing to open it. At this point, they might reach an agreement around the nuclear program. I don't think they would reach an agreement around the missile program, but I don't think, even if they reach an agreement around the nuclear program, that deal could be something that is long lasting. We've gone through this process before. Iran is a big country. It's as big as Alaska. It has there are many different nuclear sites that are undeclared.
Yeah.
And all of during the years that the JCPOA was in effect, the JCPOA was only the IAEA was only able to verify that Iran was complying with the limits that were set in JCPOA in those declared sites. In that report, very much they confirmed that they cannot verify whether there are undeclared sites and whether there's enrichment that is going beyond the levels that are allowed in JCPOA.
That is so interesting. Yeah, I first of all, let me just say I'm so enjoying this conversation because you're providing insight that I really haven't thought of before, and I'm very grateful. I'd love to get your insight on the regime's ability to survive what appeared to be a very effective first maneuver by the U.S. and Israel to knock out a huge number of leaders in the regime, and then there's debate as to who's in power. You're hearing reports that there's even some confusion still, and yet they persist. So what is their strength out there?
So for that, we have to go back to what happened during the Iran-Iraq war at the early years. So when the revolution took place, one of the mistakes that the revolutionaries made was that they executed all of the leaders of the military. They disbanded a lot of the military units, and then in 1980, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. And then they were met with an organized classic military that they could not really confront. What really allowed Iran to overcome their shortcomings in a war against a country that was, for the first time ever, supported both by the Soviet Union and the United States was that they adopted a doctrine that was the unorganized warfare. So they created these cells that they could each operate autonomously, and they could each make their own decisions. They could fight these wars, and they could operate detached from the leadership. That allowed them to survive a war over 8 years. The problem was that after the war was over, these cells continued to work autonomously, and IRGC built its identity around these autonomous groups. If you think about going back to what happened with the Karina affair, which was the ship that was intercepted going toward Israel that was carrying missiles, President Khatami, who was at the time in power, he was genuinely surprised. He was not aware that Iran was sending military equipment to Hezbollah at the time.
Wow.
But there were the military, a lot of the military leadership, even the IRGC leadership, were not aware of what was going on. These are the cells that have been operating, and well, right now in this war, this is coming to their end, to their aid. Their ability to operate in a very decentralized way. Now, can this be controlled? Yes, it can be controlled when there is no clear leadership that they can fight on behalf of that leadership. But the problem is that the United States and Israel, instead of focusing on eliminating that leadership, they decided that they're going to cripple all of Iran's military capabilities. Iran is a big country. There is absolutely no way in a 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 week time period from a distance with like 400 airplanes and some missiles, you can completely knock out all of Iran's military capabilities. And they thought that keeping some leadership in place so they could have some negotiations would allow them to extend the time that they have. I think that was a really terrible strategy at this point. The best strategy would have been to remove those decision makers, allow for these cells to realize that they're operating on their own, and then put some help bring some new leadership in place that could call in all these cells and hopefully absorb them into a more classic form of a military structure.
Could they have done this, in this case, the U.S. and Israel, without putting boots on the ground?
Yes, I think they can. This was perhaps the most achievable thing without boots on the ground. Mm-hmm. The same kind of targeting that targeted Ali Khamenei, the same kind of targeting that targeted some of the top leadership, the same type of targeting should have been used to target the top leadership in IRGC. And instead of playing around with them, that would have been a much easier way to bring this entire regime to its knees. At some point, the U.S. and Israel, they need to realize that no matter what, this Iran, whether you're supporting the regime or you're not supporting the regime, they have the knowledge of how to make missiles. They have the knowledge of how to operate and run a nuclear program. And we have to live with that and hope that we live with that under a regime that is friendly, that is democratic, that is not going to prioritize spending $1 trillion of Iranian people's oil money into a program when that money can be well spent into a whole a wide array of other infrastructure investments.
Where do we go from here? What's the potential solution, if you will? What's the best case scenario moving forward?
It's hard to tell. The best case scenario for Iranian people would be for some form of a change in the regime. Now, whether the Iranian people find the confidence to come to the streets and not be killed by now not just the Iranian forces, but also the thousands of Iraqi, Afghan, and Pakistani militia that have been brought to the streets of Tehran and other large cities, and demand change. Hopefully, that some voices within the regime hearing them and then cooperating with them, transitioning into a changing regime that is with less violence, with less bloodshed. That would be ideal. And the second best scenario would be for the U.S. and Israel to realize that they can't deal with this regime, either put them under pressure to either vacate power or maybe eliminate them. But the worst situation would be to keep them in power, knowing that they will go after a new nuclear program that will be very difficult to figure out where it is, and also then try to and then rebuild a missile program that they don't. If they knew where exactly every single missile silo was, they would have hit them by now.
Yeah.
If they knew where, and this would, by the same logic, they're not aware of where every single nuclear site in Iran is. Mm-hmm. And in Iran has many. They spend $1 trillion, and $1 trillion in Iran goes a long way.
Wow. So moving forward, from your perspective as someone with relatives in the country, do you stay in touch? Well, I mean, what's the approach to communicating with them at this point?
Well, we use different chat services. Telegram is one. WhatsApp has been harder, so we don't use it as much. But Telegram has been the most reliable. Some people have access to Starlink receivers. I know that occasionally they have to either hide them or disguise them or turn them off so that they're not detected. There are these periods of time that the government, I hear that because they want to update their firewalls, we have these times that internet becomes available for a short period of time, and people use those times to connect. But that is the only way. We leave a message, we wait a few hours, they send us back a message, and that is the only way that we communicate.
All right. Well, Pouya Seifzadeh, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Professor Seifzadeh joining us from SUNY Geneseo. Very grateful, as once again, the insight that I've just received. I feel like I just went to a lecture series. So I hope that you got from this what I feel like I got, and this is the type of information that we try to pass on through this Adam interview series, which can only be found on the Rochester First app. So with that in mind, please tell your friends and family about the Rochester First app as we continue to grow it out and provide more and more content. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Get the Rochester First streaming app today for everything you love from News 8 On Demand, plus exclusive shows you won't see anywhere else. Search ROC and download for free on Roku, Amazon Fire, and Apple TV.